I'm Tyler, and this is the AntiSocial Network.
Don't look away. Let the fear wash over you.
How? How do you manage every time to pick open a wound to a fresher hell?
Welcome to your number one source of internet oddities.
My IQ is the highest among all Reddit.
That's not saying much.
Here we host conversations with interesting people across the internet.
There's something beyond the direct physical observable world. You can't quantify, you can't put under a microscope. If you don't want to, immediately adopt the Muslim understanding of that, that's fine. You'll get there eventually.
You haven't heard of them, but I have.
It's not just witchcraft, it's nerds. You guys are nerds. My parents didn't let me read Harry Potter, not because of the demonic elements. They just didn't want me to be a nerd.
Join us every Friday for discussions on culture, entertainment, politics, religion, and whatever happens to catch our fancy that week.
I've always deemed myself an evil capitalist.
Because that's how they get you. They get in your head. They start making you ask funny questions. And before you know it, bang, you're a liberal.
I thought it was a matter of record.
Social credit deducted.
You're probably thinking this is some pretty deep stuff, and you're right.
Hello and welcome to the show. We are doing something a little differently this week because this is technically the 100th episode of the AntiSocial Network. I don't know, nothing too huge a change, but I wanted to bring on someone who hasn't been on the podcast properly. But if you go back into my deep backlog of miscellaneous videos on this YouTube channel, you will find that my guest appeared twice when I did public access show. She just finished up a master's degree at the University of Rochester, where she studied Romanticism. And if you'll go back, you'll see we did episodes of public access on Jesus Christ Superstar and Shakespeare's Hamlet on film. How's it going, Meg?
It's going good. It's been busy. I graduated in June and moved back, and honestly, things have just kind of stayed busy since then. But it's good overall.
Has there been any loss of hope in going from one busy time of life to another busy time of life? Because it seems like the pedal never comes off the metal.
Yeah, no, at this point, it's kind of that way because, I'm sort of in a transition stage in my life because, I graduated with this literature degree, and then I'm like, you know what, in grad school is a whole different story, but I came out of it realizing I really want to do something creative rather than critical. So I'm back to my roots and trying to become an artist, so starting up, that art business is going to take a while, and it's kind of never-ending busyness for now. And then of course, I'm teaching too as a substitute, which has been a growing experience. I have a lot of teaching experience anyways, but not necessarily with kids at a public school. So so it's been busy, but it's been good.
Are the public school kids harder than the ones you had to teach at the university level?
In different ways, as you can imagine. They're junior high school students, right? So I taught 18, 19-year-olds in college, freshman composition. So that was obviously really different. And then junior high school kids, the junior high school kids, they're maturing and they're growing and all that sort of thing. And then the content is somewhat similar, but also different because you're kind of taking it down to that level and everything. So it's been, a bit of a challenge, but a good one.
I would imagine. So, just so people have a little context, could you talk a little about what you're doing now in terms of your creative output?
Yeah, for sure. Well, so for my master's degree, my capstone project was not a research paper. It was a creative writing, poetry sort of piece, and it was about the length of a chapbook, which is between 30 and 40 or 50 pages. Whereas a whole length poetry book is maybe 100 or a little bit less than that. And so, I actually finished with a creative sort of project, which actually is also about Romanticism and kind of how artwork inspired by the Romantics and everything kind of has context in today's world. And I do that similar sort of thing in my art too. So I'm an oil painter. I'm pretty traditional. I'm again inspired by the romantic side of things in art as well as poetry. I represent a lot of stories and literature and poems in my art. And I try to, recontextualize it for a modern audience. But that's what I'm doing now. My bachelor's degree is in studio art, so I'm going back to that and just trying to make my way.
There you go. So I guess just to kind of jump right into the meat of the topic of Romanticism, but how did you kind of fall into that rabbit hole? Because I recall, we met around college, or we started hanging out around college, and you were working graphic design in a furniture warehouse, and then all of a sudden you transplant yourself halfway across the country to the University of Rochester, and you spend what 7 years, give or take, there, just or something crazy
not
like that.
Long. Just 4. I'm not that old.
It was.
My God, if I took 7 years on a master's degree.
You were getting dangerously close to professional student territory, but not quite. But you were.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I had been in a PhD program because I went there to get my PhD. But long story short, I mean, I realized I wanted to get back to creative stuff, like I said, and I tried to do that in that program, but for many different reasons, it didn't work out. So I took the master's where I could do a creative project. But anyway, so it's 4 years there. My first job out of college was I was a creative copywriter for a furniture company, which is it was a really cool job for 1 year, but it wasn't like what I wanted to do long term. And so grad school is something that always had appealed to me, and I knew it'd be a good growing experience, and I did not know where it was going to lead me. In terms of Romanticism, I chose that era and field of study because in one of my seminars in my senior year in undergrad, I was kind of my first time of really being exposed to that era of poetry, because before that I was really kind of interested in Victorian era, which is related obviously and bleeds into it. But I fell in love with the Romantics during that seminar because they it's kind of cliche, but they're so original, right? And they're so in tune with their emotions, and they're very introspective. And being introspective is something that's kind of philosophy for me in my own life, and that resonated. So that kind of started everything. And then after that, I don't know, I kept going with it, and instead of losing interest in it, I just kind of gained interest in it. And I think the Romantic era strongly relates to my identity as an artist too, which is again tying in this interest, because the Romantics were so interested in what makes an artist, and the power behind individual creativity. And a lot of their writing, a lot of their poetry is really about how to be an artist and how that connects with yourself spiritually too, not just creating something. So all that kind of mixed together to sort of bridge my interest in both literature and art, and just really spoke to me.
So I guess just to kind of simplify, how would you define Romanticism as an elevator pitch? Because as a concept, it is one of those things where the more you really dig into it, the more subjective and hard to describe it is, because it seems to apply somewhat differently to everyone who described themselves as a romantic, and you got different results out of everyone who described themselves as a romantic. Well, what is it more of a? Do you think that there's a specific tone or a style to it, or is it more of a process?
Well, and I think so. I worked with Morris Eves, which he's one of the best romanticist scholars that we have, and he also hated this question because he would also say I mean, you can do your best, but the point of Romanticism, and I mean most art movements, right, is that they are hard to define. But in the case of the Romantics, again, you kind of hit it on the head there. They're all individuals, and they prize individuality, and each romantic did his own romantic stuff in his own way, right? Some of the foundational principles you can fall back on, and that my professor probably also say, is that the Romantics internalize things, right? So that's probably the number one thing. They took spirituality, they took the creative process, they took everything and they put it kind of inside oneself, and that filtering through yourself and knowing your own mind was really the starting point, right? And then I guess branching off of their other hallmarks of the Romantic movement would be nature, and kind of idealizing nature, and getting spiritual insight from the beauty of nature, that sort of thing. And then you can throw in maybe the Gothic aesthetic, which is sort of this kind of creepy but intriguing and scary, beautiful sort of aesthetic. You want to think about your haunted country manor, and that sort of thing, and the supernatural, right? That's going to be a big part of it too. And all these things sort of play into the emotionality of the Romantics. And we can kind of talk about more and put these more abstract concepts into something a bit more concrete with some of the poems I have too. But yeah, I would say the number one thing to remember about the Romantics, they took everything and they kind of put it inside of them, and like that's how they sort of made their art. And again, we can talk about that.
Sure. I mean, before we jump into that, obviously, I think what you're going to present is more along the lines of the best that they can present. What just as a quick aside, do you think that there's a danger of, you know, myopia or neuroticism that comes out of Romanticism at points? Because obviously, if you have a philosophy that's this deeply rooted in introspection and individuality, that kind of precedes a lot of, you know, that can precede dangerous tendencies in some regards, especially nowadays.
100%. And then too, and even more so, like that's probably one of the biggest criticism of Romanticism and of the Romantics at the time, is that they were too self-centered. They cared too much about their own opinion, and it came off as you know, kind of shallow, which the Romantics were trying to be the opposite of shallow. But basically, so the beginning of the 19th century and like kind of the end of the 18th century, you're reacting to the movement of the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment is very much on like science and learning and like, you know, kind of how our world works, and it's getting a little bit away from like a divine perspective and things like that. So the Romantics are reacting against that, and so they want this freedom of expression, this emotionality, this kind of humanist first. Like the Enlightenment sort of like lost that humanity, but also the other thing that's kind of actually very old undercurrent coming through this is that in like the early modern era, so that's like the Renaissance kind of, that's when you kind of first have this cultural concept of the self being important. And what I mean by that is like before that, in the Middle Ages, you have like you put your allegiance to like, you know, your liege lord or whatever, and like that's who you serve and that's who you're loyal to, and whether you think that or not in your mind, it doesn't necessarily matter, because he keeps you alive, you exchange your services, and that's the structure of society. It doesn't really matter who you are as an individual, your opinion, you keep it to yourself, because it's really more of a collective culture. Your focus is on the group and your family and your society and your liege lord, right? And that really kind of starts to change in the early modern era. People start to understand that their opinions and their disgruntledness or whatever with what's going on in society do matter, and that comes to service more as individuals. And I think it really kind of culminates in the Romantic era, alongside reacting to this more scientific kind of movement that's coming through. They are looking more at like, okay, like this is, I want to be, you know, connect back to my humanity, my emotionality, and who I truly am, and kind of shake off like the culture that's kind of trying to make me conform, right? So it's a big shift, and actually it's probably one of the largest shifts in culture, at least in Western culture, because we still are living under that right now. Like we very much are an individualistic culture, right? We get that right from the Romantics.
For better and worse. I mean, obviously we're kind of riding the tail end of a lot of the more narcissistic elements of that, where, you know, we don't the danger of that obviously seems to be ultimate subjectivism or moral relativism, where there's nothing outside of myself. I am, you know, my soul is a flicker of light, and then when I die, there's nothing in the universe. It's all there is. There's nothing else that's even valuable outside that. So your effect on the world is just negligible, and you could just live, you know, Epicurean bliss until you're just smited. So
yeah, and what's interesting is that the Romantics, most of them, I think, would probably cringe at that. Like they wouldn't like where that ended up, but they're the ones who started that. They put us on that path now, and that's why I think anything in its extreme is going to be problematic, right? Like, and the reason why I can still resonate with the Romantics is because I think there's some really good principles there. But you're right, insofar as in this modern culture, the idea of like kind of going back to yourself and seeing your opinion as kind of like one of the higher things in reality, rather than like other things going on, does lead to existentialism, right? And you know, Nietzsche is thrown in the middle of all that too. He kind of has that turning point. But yeah, the Romantics, and a lot of scholars will say this too, is that they put us on that track of making that switch, but we can talk kind of how that happens as well. I have some examples too.
Well, obviously we want to get into how Romanticism applies to spirituality, but let's definitely jump into some of your examples.
Sure. So okay, to kind of contextualize this a little bit, let's start with William Blake. So I studied Blake for a while. I worked on the William Blake archive, which, by the way, if viewers want to go check it out, it's a great resource. It's totally free, really high quality. It has most of the works of William Blake. I mean, we're always kind of publishing more, but basically you're going to see William Blake's images and his poetry. What's interesting about Blake is he was an engraver as well as a poet, and a painter too. So he did poetry and images together, and he's very unique in that way. So the archive is a great way to check out his work in its fullness. But anyway, so one poem that I kind of want to start off with here would be a page from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Blake is a really curious sort of figure. He's considered one of the earliest romantics, but he actually is outside of the circle of like Blake and Coleridge and then later Shelley and Keats. He was more or less like kind of middle class. He was a tradesman. Like I said, he was an engraver. So he made prints and stuff and engravings, and that's what he did for a living. And in fact, in his later years, he ended up being pretty poor. So he is known like by some of those other poets, but not really in their circles, and he knows of them too, right, because they became famous, but he was never famous in his day. And he has a very peculiar take on romanticism and kind of how he expresses his spirituality, and he's been notoriously difficult to teach and to know exactly what he's getting at, but I think he really demonstrates the principle of taking things inward, as I was talking about, really well. So here in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which is basically what we call an illuminated book, you can see that Blake has created images, and then he also wrote like this like poem, and it's a longer sort of poem. It's more or less a satire on how Blake sees current society in his day. He thinks that like systems and religious systems, political systems, anything that's traditional, he thinks is stale. He thinks it's very imprisoning to humanities, to individuals, and to culture. And he's really interested again of kind of breaking free of that. So basically here on this page, he writes that he's looking back at how he views like ancient like Greek and like Roman and whatever poets and stuff like that, and he's seeing that those great ancient poets were looking at reality and nature, and they were creating their own system of it. Like they kind of named it, they had this creative identification for it, and you know, he's kind of referring again to like, I don't know, like Homer and all these like older poets and stuff, and to him, he sees it as very creative. He likes that a lot, that they're seeing the world with fresh eyes basically. However, he has a problem with the way that we have inherited that. Like he thinks that old art is great, but we need to be doing something new, and he thinks that we have idealized it too much, and we've created it too much into a system and made rules out of it. It's like if your art doesn't look like this, then it's bad, and he really hates that concept. So if we kind of look down at the end of this here, he talks about these like kind of priestly figures, and I think these are the keepers of tradition right throughout the centuries, whether they be people teaching art, or if they be priests in actual like, you know, like religion settings, or political figureheads, whatever. He calls those people out for being gatekeepers, and he says that they have created gods for us, gods in so much of like rules and laws, and that they have made us forget that men, you know, we have forgotten that all deities reside in the human breast. And so what he's saying here, if you think about it, it's kind of, you know, I mean, like it's pretty edgy for the day, because he's saying
yeah,
we've kind of created gods, or at least the way we view reality and organize reality needs to be this creative force, and we have made the mistake of forgetting that we're the ones who kind of invented that, who saw it first as like this creative thing, this you know, artwork, naming and understanding nature and all this stuff, and creating poetry and art and everything. We've forgotten that the creative power is within us, and that we actually have something of the divine sort of creativity going on, and instead we become enslaved to the rules of how art should be, or how religion or spirituality should be. So that's his gist here. Now it's really interesting because, you know, it's hard to say if Blake truly believes that there isn't like a God, and that we ourselves are gods. or if this is just how he thinks that we should function, like, little divinities, and kind of be this creative force and make new things, and that we're actually drawing from like a realm of something that's a little bit more divine. So I'm kind of rambling, so I'm gonna let you ask the question if that makes sense so far.
Well, one of the things I've heard about Marriage of Heaven and Hell specifically is that it advocates for a certain level of universalism in its understanding of morality. That all sin in the world kind of ultimately points back to God. Ultimately, all goodness, all evil in the world is ultimately something that God has put into the world that will be mended, or to some degree, and that kind of reflected in the title.
Well, maybe. Well, I don't know about that in so much. I think you see that more in The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Coleridge and stuff, which we could kind of briefly talk about. And there's so much to talk about because each romantic's so different.
Yeah.
But at least in this one, like, I think for Blake, he has a broader understanding of what constitutes like good and evil. Like for him, I think he's more about having people having more genuine and like living better lives. Like he actually was very in tune to like some of the injustices going on in his world. Like he lived not too far away from an institution that was basically like an orphanage, and he saw a lot of injustice going on there. He actually was taken to trial too because a British soldier kind of threw him under the bus. That's a long story, but it was unjust. He shouldn't have been arrested and taken to trial. So Blake really sees issues with his culture and everything like that. And I think for him, he sees maybe, and I don't want to say too much because I don't think I have a strong opinion on like how Blake sees sin and like goodness, but I think for him it's like being more authentic, taking care of those around you, trying to get like the authenticity of goodness back in instead of just like the law of good and evil back in. But The Marriage of Heaven and Hell in general is a satire. Blake is really reacting to and satirizing his culture, right?
Sure.
So in terms of sin, I don't know. I think that some things that Blake permits would be against like his culture's rigidity definition of sin. Like he's actually pretty open to talking about like, marriage in terms of like pleasure and like all. He's very open, a lot of the romantics were, and that would be kind of against the grain. But for Blake, that's not like sinful. It's just part of like living life.
Sure.
So that kind of gets a little bit blurred, as it does with a lot of the romantics. In terms of like, I think the larger question here that a lot of people want to know with Blake is that like, did he believe that like we are gods, or did he have a different understanding of that? And I'm not sure you're ever going to pin Blake down, but I think it's kind of important to like talk about where he stands. So here it says that all men forgot that deities reside in the human breast, right? I think for him, he's saying that the type of deities that represent nature and art and all of those things that create the rigidity of religion, those are all works of art and should be treated as thus coming from humanity. But Blake also believes in different levels of reality, and he does believe in a divine realm, right? And I don't think that he thinks that divine realm is necessarily completely internal of people. I think he does believe it's somewhat external, and that we access it and we go there to that divine realm, and then we bring stuff back out of that divine realm and create artwork like through our own perspective, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, that sounds very Platonistic.
Yeah, in a lot of ways it is. I think the other thing too, and this is kind of controversial in Blake studies, but I believe that Blake is very esoteric, and again, esotericism is a large part of the culture at this time, and a lot of scholars don't really care to research that because to them it's like kind of like weird and like a side note. But I think it really actually underlies a lot of the romantics thinking, and it was a really big part of the culture. But anyway, so let me see if I can find it here. Yeah, so a poet, a painter, a musician, architect, the man or woman who is not one of these is not a Christian. You must leave fathers, mothers, and houses and lands if they stand in the way of art. And then he says the eternal body of man is the imagination, that is God himself. And again, here it's kind of really likening, us to having that creative power of God. And he also says that if you're not basically an artist, or if you don't think like an artist, you're not a Christian. Like, you cannot bring the Christian, I guess, philosophy. You cannot change the world in a Christian way unless you are an artist, which is super, super interesting. And here again, Blake still says that, like, you know, the eternal body of man is the imagination, and the imagination is God himself. Now, again, like I said, really seems like God, like Blake is saying that men are gods, right? I think that we have to look a little bit deeper than that. The imagination, I think, for Blake comes from the eternal realm, comes from the godly realm. There's another poem in his like longer illuminated books called Jerusalem, where Blake says, if you take metaphorically a golden thread, if you find that golden thread somewhere in your life and you kind of roll it up, it'll lead you to Jerusalem's wall. And he sees Jerusalem as kind of walling the eternal realm, which is like God's realm, right? And so we need to get to that realm and bring back the godliness, and that through ourselves. And that imagination is what's connected to that godly realm, and that comes from inside of us and it kind of goes out. But I do think that Blake still believes in an external God. He just really thinks that we need to take responsibility for accessing that and then releasing it into the world to have our own creative power. If that ramble makes sense.
Yeah, there's plenty to digest, but I get the overall direction of introspection, to kind of pull something out of yourself to make it to bring something divine into the world. Just kind of it's almost I'm thinking of Tolkien's philosophy on creation when you describe it that way. But anyway, we can move on to the next thing. So
yeah, sorry. So that's a lot of Blake. And we can maybe, I don't know if there's any questions you have on that, and we can move on from there. But Blake is, again, probably the hardest ones, because he's so shifty. Like, he says things and he kind of like says them very abstractly, and then he sort of says other things that seem to contradict it. So it's pretty crazy, but I think that, you know, I got the principle there, and I think it illuminates some stuff about Romanticism.
Sure. The only thing I would, you know, just at a glance, it does. I see what you mean about not necessarily being able to put them together in a way that's coherent. Just because if all of his poems are that way, then I could definitely see that requiring, you know, a couple centuries of academic consideration to really try to nail any of that into the wall. So.
Yeah, for sure. And I mentioned esotericism, which maybe I should say a little bit more about to give us more of a groundwork. And I don't know how much time we have either.
Whatever you got. So no
okay.
Rush.
So with esotericism, basically, if you want to think about it as like, it comes from super ancient, but like the ancient mystery traditions from like the Romans to the Greeks up to the Egyptians, if you're kind of going back in time, they have this idea of secret rites and stuff they would do to access the, you know, divine powers of their religious system and things like that. And basically, if you look across most of those cultures, this is kind of how it works. Very like rough, okay? You have like this spiritual realm, and that spiritual realm creates blueprints, so to speak, and the blueprints underlie all of reality. So all of like the physical things and material things come from the spiritual realm, and that emerges. And when I talk about like kind of the secret like rituals and stuff like that, they believe in doing certain types of rituals in order to access that realm and bring more things into reality. You can think of alchemy, you can think of black and white magic. That all comes from esotericism and like ancient mystery traditions. But also it's really found in the intellectual era too. In like the 1600s, Sir Francis Bacon was pretty esoteric. Like, his goal in setting up his like science research facility and like that sort of thing was actually to try to find these patterns, these invisible patterns that come from the spiritual realm by reinventing, by reverse engineering, right? So he's looking at the physical world and he's trying to get to the spiritual world to see if he can find those universal patterns and stuff like that. And that's the same thing as Blake is doing too. Blake just believes that the artist can access that spiritual realm and then bring things into manifestation in reality. And that's kind of abstract too, but I don't want to get too much into esotericism because that's a whole nother discussion. I just think those are the basics people should kind of know about.
Yeah, I mean, it's functionally, it kind of has, it sounds very similar to numerology or astronomy in that kind of recognizing the patterns of the universe, but obviously when you bring the mystery cults into it, then you kind of start bringing in like the occult and stuff like that. So I imagine this all kind of just bleeds together in strange ways.
No, it does completely. It's all connected to each other. It all kind of functions the same basic principle, and yeah, I mean, and they basically thought that if they found these invisible patterns or these, because like alchemy is like turning different things into gold or whatever, that they could literally change reality like that. That's what they believed, and the Romantics, I think, really adhere to those ideas, but just in a more artistic, abstract way. They see the creative power as being able to change reality in that way.
So I saw are the other poems Keats then?
So I have Shelley, I have Wordsworth, and I have a little bit of Tennyson too.
Okay, I saw Ode, and I for some reason thought that was Keats. So.
Oh yeah, no, no, I didn't go to Keats' Grecian Urn.
No, that's fine.
Which is interesting too. Yeah. So I mean, really quickly, like Wordsworth. So his Intimations of Immortality.
He's the one I'm the most familiar with, just because I've read a little into lyrical ballads, and he's basically the most famous of his generation. So.
He is, and it's funny. I don't even like Wordsworth that much. I think he's kind of a jerk. He's very self-centered, and that was one of his criticisms, and like I said, of most of the Romantics. But he's not super nice to Coleridge, which like I get, they had some personal beefs, and Coleridge got into some nasty things, but Coleridge to me is a little bit more vulnerable and honest in his work, and Wordsworth just, he has a little bit more of an agenda in my opinion. But anyway, so in the beginning here, you can kind of see like a very similar thing I was talking about to Blake. Wordsworth also sees humans as having been connected to some sort of divine realm, and as we move further into the world and mature in the world, we kind of lose that, but it's sort of the poet's job to bring that back. So he says, there was a time when meadow, grove, and stream, the earth, and every common sight to me did seem apparelled in celestial light, the glory and freshness of a dream. It is not now as it hath been of yore. Turn whosoever I may, by night or day, the things which I have seen, I now can see no more. So again here, he's really seeing, he imagines, childhood when he was younger, and I think we can think about this as the imaginative of children we see even now. Wordsworth is observing that, and he's like, yeah, I remember being that way, but the world has kind of sucked that out of me, and I'm not as connected to it as I once was. And so he's kind of mourning that a little bit and seeing if he can recreate that in his poetry. And so again, it's that same pattern of looking at that sort of divine origin and then bringing it more to reality, right? And it's the same thing to the famous line from the preface of Lyrical Ballads. Wordsworth says, poetry, good poetry, is like the overflow of emotion. But what people forget is that the next part of that sentence basically says it's the overflow of emotion, but recollected in tranquility. So that means that you, again, the poet's job is, yes, to like access that sublime realm, but then for Wordsworth, he wants to focus it in and make it into something that makes sense, something that's beautiful, something that's more controlled within your own, tranquility and your own time to like sort of reflect on it, if that kind of makes sense too.
Sure.
Yeah, well, it's a little bit different than Blake, because I think Blake is more raw about it. Like Blake is like, he's an artist, he's gonna go for it, he sees things differently than everyone else, and he is gonna make that known, right? Wordsworth also sees that, but in a much more refined way. He really does prize like, okay, having this like strong emotions important, it's necessary, but it's not everything, it's not even half of it. You have to go back and you have to know yourself, and then you have to recreate those strong emotions in ways that make sense, that people can understand, right? So yeah, that's kind of where Wordsworth is at in this spectrum. I don't know, do you have any questions about that, or do you want to move on?
It definitely seems like that we're moving a little bit away from pure subjectivism, because for the most part, it seems like, whatever Blake is getting at, he seems to be the most objective, and we're just kind of moving a little bit farther, a little bit closer into a sense of actual truth that can be brought out of this philosophy, and a sense of actual objectivity, because I think that core objectivity has to be like at the core of this for any of this to actually be to be both beautiful and useful to some degree.
Yeah, and understandable too. I mean, that's the hardest thing about Blake is he's so hard to understand, and he almost doesn't care, and he kind of wants people to be their own artists. He's like, however that looks, he wants us to be that way. Wordsworth definitely has a right and a wrong when it comes to executing art. Yeah, so yeah, you're right, we are moving a little bit more, at least for Wordsworth, in terms of objectivity. And I am not one to be against objective stuff. I think there should be standards in art, but I think Wordsworth can be a little too stiff with that. He I don't know, he has his own like ways of thinking, and he's hard pressed to kind of change from that, in my opinion. In fact, later in life, Coleridge and Wordsworth stopped being friends, kind of because Coleridge actually disagreed with some stuff with that Wordsworth was saying. I mean, Wordsworth was, a lot of people say, the better poet, and Coleridge the better critic. And this is because Wordsworth didn't always think about what he was saying in terms of a critical sense super logically. Like, he thought that his preface to lyrical ballads, the whole, good poetry has to have this amazing expression of emotion, it has to be all this stuff. He didn't think about the logical extremes of that, whereas Coleridge was able to do that. And Coleridge actually criticized Wordsworth later, saying like, if every good poem like has this outburst of emotion, even if it's like kind of refined by tranquility and like reflection, there are definitely examples of good poetry that doesn't have the outburst of emotion that you're talking about, Wordsworth. Like, you can't have that as a standard. And Wordsworth was like, yeah, you're right, but I never want to be a good critic anyway, I'm just the better poet. And then Coleridge is like, well, I'm the critic, and they had this beef about it. So that's a tangent, but yeah, it kind of just shows Wordsworth is like a little bit stuck up, in my opinion.
Cool. Just in general, I for some reason I always mix up Coolidge with Coleridge, but I always say the wrong one when I'm saying that name. But Coleridge does seem to have been the one that have a better person, but also seemed to have a more thought out world life philosophy than most of the other romantics. If only just because he was the most overtly Christian of the lot, but. I get at least to some degree, I get the sense that he had his life a little bit better, more pulled together than Lord Byron did, to the point where he had some sort of a greater sense of his internal inertia and this greater sense of how he could use his art in a way that was, more grounded in this objective reality we keep kind of circling around. So.
Yeah, and I dislike Byron too. I'll talk about two poets I dislike, but I study this era. Byron annoys me as well, probably for similar reasons as Wordsworth.
Oh man! So here's something fun you should do, because I don't want to say where you are, but when I went to last summer when I went to Wheaton College at the Marion Wade Center, they own most of C.S. Lewis's library there, and it's all annotated, really? And they have his copy of Don Juan by Lord Byron. And one of the things he would do is he would always label all of his books with notes, and at the end of it he would write when he wrote it and his final thoughts on it. And about halfway through the Lord Byron through Don Juan, he stops writing, and then when you turn to the final page, it just says completed XYZ note 1936, never again.
Oh my goodness, I could completely see C.S. Lewis saying that about Byron. Yeah, I mean, and I'm being a little bit of a stickler. Like, when I read Byron, I don't hate it. He has some beautiful work. He again is just very much interested in putting on a performance in his poetry. He's like, the Byronic hero comes from him. He's the troubled bad boy and the, I don't know, like the dark hero, right? That's always appealing in culture. And you see, that's what his poetry is about. And it is very self-focused. It's about like expressing emotion, and C.S. Lewis probably would hate that.
Yeah, that and I just find Lord Byron to be a lout in general. So I'm kind of like a little, but I haven't read Child Heralds yet. So, but at some point I will. But
yeah, I've read parts of it too. I can't even get through all of it. It's just too much Byron. But yeah, I mean, Byron had a pretty troubled life, so all that kind of plays into it as well. But yeah, Coleridge, I mean, towards the end of his life, Coleridge had it more together. He became, like I said, he became the premier critic in England at the time for literature. And in fact, Ruskin bases a lot of his stuff on Coleridge. He's the next premier critic in the Victorian era after Coleridge. And so Coleridge is super influential. And Coleridge also kind of So Wordsworth and Coleridge were actually very extremist in their religious views early in their careers. So like Lyrical Ballads, that time, it was like came out in 1798. They were interested more in like determinism and Unitarianism. I don't know if I want to get into that discussion, but it does play in with the whole spectrum of the Romantics and their religious pursuits. Blake, we don't really know exactly what was going on with Blake. Blake was Blake, as I explained as best I could. With Coleridge and Wordsworth at that time, so Coleridge especially followed Joseph Priestley, who was a Unitarianism, and Priestley basically, so Unitarianism at the time bleeds into determinism. Unitarianism does believe that Jesus Christ and God are separate, right? They do not believe in the Trinity really, and determinism plays into this. They saw this kind of speaks to your point earlier. It's more of a Coleridge thing. They saw the whole world as being under God's control, and good and bad things happening to someone to shape them. I think Coleridge in a letter describes this as like being like a stone in a river and being shaped along the course of your life. So you kind of are this really impressionable sort of object in determinism, and everything you experience is purposeful and done by God, more or less indirectly, and then it makes you who the person you're supposed to be by the end of it. A lot of people had a problem with this because it actually eliminates original sin, because Coleridge and Priestley believed at that time that if sin and bad things in the world happen to make you who you are, there really is no such thing as guilt, because it's not our choice. It was going to happen no matter what. It was predetermined completely, right? And so same thing with original sin that was meant to happen. We shouldn't bear that guilt. We're just along this journey. And so it was actually really controversial for the time. It was kind of not a cult, but a weird sect. And Coleridge was really into it. He was like kind of a traveling like pastor, and he gave a lot of speeches on this and sermons and stuff. And the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, in my opinion, really exemplifies this in an allegorical sort of way. The Ancient Mariner, if you read that whole thing, it's one of my favorite poems. It basically shows a man who is caught up in his never-ending journey to repent for a sin that wasn't really a sin, right? Like you can see different like things of like Christ-like coming through, and like kind of Adam coming through. Like the mariner famously shoots the albatross, right? But he doesn't know why he does it. Like he just does it. Like it's like an impulse thing, and then he has to pay penance for the rest of the poem on it. And again, like he goes through life in a very like kind of guided sort of half understanding what's going on way, but by the end of it becomes a better person, right? And then he's cursed to keep telling his story to different people, and that kind of is the frame of the poem. He actually goes to a wedding guest and tells that wedding guest the story, and withholds the wedding guest from the wedding he was supposed to go to tell his story. And so in that sense, you can really see this sort of passive, like everyman, this passive character, and that reveals Coleridge's idea of spirituality at that time, where there really isn't any good or evil. We're all being molded by God, basically. And he got a lot of heat from that, and he actually renounces that eventually, and he turns to become much more orthodox. And by the time he's an established critic, he's much more orthodox, and he looks back on the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and he says, you know what, I would wish people would just look at that work as like a work of pure fancy or pure imagination. He doesn't want people to see his religious like allegory in there anymore, because he doesn't associate it with it. He does then kind of denounce determinism, and he goes back more to a free will model and things like that in spirituality, which is interesting. I think Coleridge is pretty authentic throughout his whole experience and how much he's changed. Like he is pretty honest about where he's been and how those things sort of change the way he sees things, and you can really see he's always searching for meaning throughout his whole life. But yeah, so that's like the short and sweet, or maybe short and messy version of Coleridge.
I'm gonna have to kill this tangent before it goes on much longer, but I mentioned universalism earlier, but I think determinism is probably the word I should have used, because I've spoken. I don't know if you've read C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, but the title is a direct allusion to On the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which.
Oh, okay.
So I mean, he even if you read the book's introduction, he says that directly. Is like, I don't exactly know what Blake was on about when he said the marriage of heaven and hell, but I think that as an Orthodox Christian, we need to I think that these two things shouldn't never the twain should meet, and the poem is a meditation on the concept of the Refrigerium, where souls from hell are transported up to the outskirts of heaven and given one final chance to seek salvation, and it's kind of a meditation on what it actually takes to allow the part of your soul to embrace salvation, what it means, what the scope of heaven actually means to the scope of hell, and but the idea Lewis is ultimately getting at is the idea that there has to be an eternal separation, and eventually, hell or annihilation or whatever you believe in, it ends up being permanent at some point, because at some point it's what you choose. At some point you are locking the door of hell from the inside out, and not letting God take you up into his presence and take you up into who he is supposed to be. So it's another one of those examples of Lewis being, I guess, his poetry being a little more on the more modernist side, deeply not even deeply, just kind of very concerned about the Romantics and what they're what the actual end point of that philosophy ends up being. And it is something interesting too, that so many of the Romantics ended up not necessarily growing out of their youthful beliefs, but especially with Mary Shelley and Wordsworth and several others, it seems like the ones that didn't die young ultimately got to a point in their life where they're like, yeah, I'm just going to go to church and get over it.
Well, yeah, and we can talk about more like why that is and how I think they got there. And it's interesting too that you talk about the Lewis's response to Blake in that way, and I agree that like he might not totally have understood Blake, because I think if he did understand Blake a little bit more, and I shouldn't comment on like how like Lewis is a better writer than I am.
I would recommend reading the book, because just because it does seem like it's more of a response to the overall idea of determinism and the degree to which original sin actually permeates the world and separates us from God, which in that sense it definitely is a schism with Blake. But I'm sure I'm sure that Blake isn't just a complete heretic or completely useless in that regard, but it's definitely one of those interesting needles to thread where it can, depending on how you take it, it's like anything else with the Romantics, depending on how you take it, it's either digging truth out of reality, or it's making you myopic and self-centered.
Yeah, completely. And it was interesting too, is I think there are some things in there that Lewis might be okay with Blake. So I think the reason why Blake says the marriage of heaven and hell is to be controversial, first off. And
oh yeah,
I think what Blake is saying too is that our reality is more like a marriage of heaven and hell, because like I said, heaven and hell, it's a satire against what he sees as like the religious spirit, and what he sees is like rigid politics and religion and everything, and that to him is hell. And so he's trying to resurrect people out of that and bring them up. And this image, it's interesting because Lewis says, like, as you kind of mentioned, it's a kind of a narrative or a commentary on how people are given another chance, right? Blake's all about that too. He is trying to set people free from being very rigid and everything. And Lewis is a little bit more rigid. He's definitely more orthodox. He wants people to have a certain view of like who God is. But I think Blake is on a similar mission of trying to set people free from their own bondages as well. And I think, like everything, you take the good from both, right? And I think that they can kind of actually have a good marriage. So yeah, I think Lewis, if he kind of saw the real heart of what Blake was getting at, might be okay with some things actually. And this image to me sort of represents that, because Blake, again, it's that same sort of image, just different ways of getting there.
Okay, next example. We can't go down this rabbit hole any further.
There are so many rabbit holes, and I'm not even like, the more I bring up, the less clear it becomes.
Well, we're kind of moving in the right direction, so let's just keep going through the examples.
Yeah, okay, so let's see. So I have him to intellectual beauty, and that's like the last one of like the core romantics that we think about, and then I can talk about what happened sort of in the Victorian era and their understanding of like how religion is evolving at that point, and that'll help us, I think, wrap up a little bit more.
All right, let's do it.
So Shelley, Percy Shelley. He is one of the younger romantics. He's kind of the next generation after like Coleridge and Wordsworth. And Shelley is one of like the few self-proclaimed atheists at the time. But again, I kind of went through each romantic so far, how they sort of saw spirituality a little bit differently. Shelley's atheism is not our atheism. And so I kind of want to talk about what that means. And it still fits in with the romantic, principles really well. So this is Hymn to Intellectual Beauty. It's one of my favorite from Shelley's. Like Shelley, his way with words is gorgeous. Like it's beautiful. I don't like his core belief system necessarily the same way as I resonate with like maybe Coleridge's journey. Because again, like Shelley's very much interested in cutting God proper out of the picture, right? So let's kind of start here. So this poem is basically about his understanding of aesthetics and beauty and how that's important for a poet, but not only just a poet, but it for him, it should become spirituality. Beauty should be spirituality. Beauty should be religion, not necessarily a god. So at the end here, let me see where I want to start. So at this last stanza, I think it kind of sums it up pretty well. Thus let thy power, so intellectual beauty, right? He sees as like this sort of spiritual entity that's invisible, but sort of rules all things, and it comes to men and everything, but it's not a god necessarily. Maybe like the muse from like Greco-Roman era, you can think of it something like that, but to Shelley, it's a little bit more abstract. So he says, thus let thy power, which like the truth of nature on my passive youth descended to my onward life supply, its calm to one who worships thee, and every form containing thee, whom, spirit fair, thy spells did bind to fear himself and love all humankind. So, I mean, the lyrical, nature of it's just really beautiful. But what Shelley's saying here is that he's really interested in sort of like this overwhelming sort of imaginative power, like kind of like when you have that like spark of inspiration. Like to Shelley, that's sort of his spiritual like core, right? And he defends this, and he sees this as being sort of like the undercurrent for spirituality. And he's not usually gonna say like, okay, it comes from a divine realm necessarily. He sees it more, I think, as like maybe a collective imagination. He sees like spiritual things as undercurrents behind nature and things like that. So almost kind of going back to like this pagan sort of worldview where you have spirits that are in and behind different things in nature, right? And this Shelley's kind of piecing together as sort of the thing that fuels goodness and beauty and love and all that sort of thing. And that to him is really his central spirituality. And you can see how it's different from our atheism today. Like Shelley still sees patterns in this world. He still sees things, he sees spiritual things coming through into the material world. And again, you can see the patterns of esotericism in here too. Like I said earlier, you can see how Shelley's talking about this spirit that really kind of creates like emotion, and it descends onto onward by life supply. It's calm, every form containing in this spiritual thing, it descends on him, and he can make art after having that being descend on him, right? It's again esoteric, so spiritual stuff coming into reality, but there's no God per se, and that's kind of what makes him a little bit of an atheist, but not our kind of atheist. Like I said, our kind of atheist is like nothing means anything, the world doesn't have any patterns, it's random, tragedy happens, good things happen, but it doesn't mean anything, kind of like how you were saying, it's existentialism, right? Shelley's not there yet. He is not an existentialist, but I wanted to show you guys this because I think it's another really unique imprint of a romantic, how they follow the principles but make it their own, right? Any questions about Shelley?
Not particularly. I mean, it seems a little more straightforward. I did kind of the image that came to mind. I don't want to keep circling around C.S. Lewis, but I'm gonna do that anyway. The image that came to mind when you were talking was his description of light through a keyhole, where he has this really vivid image of how how narrow knowledge comes to you, where if you're in a tool shed and everything's dark and there's a beam of light that comes through, from the outside you see from the outside of that beam you just see a beam of light, but you stare through the beam of light and then suddenly the entire world illuminates up through your eye, and suddenly you only see the world outside through the beam hole. And there's he kind of uses that as his a metaphor for spiritual understanding and the way that the way you approach things enlightens your understanding of the world and what pours into you, and it kind of lets you unlock this greater reality. I mean, Lewis was obviously kind of a Platonist, so it mostly just aligns on those grounds. But in this case, obviously, it's just a lot more. It doesn't come off as myopic as some of the. I shouldn't say Blake is myopic, but it doesn't come off as kind of unfocused. It just kind of feels naive in a way, a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd call it naive, because I feel like, and you're summarizing it like I guess a little bit more straightforwardly. But for me, I would say that I mostly agree with that train of thought. I like Lewis's metaphor there, and I think that a lot of the romantics would see it similarly. I think Coleridge would see it similarly in his later years. He does see true imagination, the artist's true like creative force. He sees it as coming from God. He sees it as like a divine inspiration. And Coleridge actually also believes that like because artists have access to kind of, in a way, I don't think he uses this language, but I see it this way. In a way, he sees artists as like prophets, because they're seeing stuff from God and they're bringing it to fruition. He doesn't use that language, but it's kind of that pattern. And that kind of I think parallels what Lewis is kind of trying to say, right? Like how we can access that realm if we focus in a certain way and understand who God is in a certain way, and it comes from God through the artist, and that's true art, true insight, true revelation. I agree with that. Like that's kind of how I see a lot of my art. It's kind of how I see some of the romantics too, those who are a little bit more on the conservative side, I guess. But yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense to me.
No comment. I agree.
But no, I mean, that was good. I like that metaphor a lot. I think and also I think it helps make things concrete, like what I was trying to say before, because I'm throwing a lot at you right now.
No, I mean I'm reading an academic textbook on music theory and intellectual beauty right now, so this is like a step down from where I've been for the last 3 days of reading. It's like, this is all just Platonic stuff. I can do that.
Yeah, it basically is. Yeah, and they were very, because I mean, Plato, you get to esotericism, right? Like that's related to that, so it's basically the same thing. And I mean, you see that this pattern too, like all religions and all cultures have the pattern of like spirituality first influencing concrete reality. It's just in different ways and stuff. Yeah, so I think those are like the core romantic stuff, and kind of give you a little bit of a flavor of how each one sees it differently, how they process the ideas of esotericism, kind of their core principles, how they bring things into themselves, whether it's from in Coleridge's early case, determinism. Coleridge is kind of interesting because determinism really is external, but he is making art in a way that still is very personal. Like he's talking about his own journey, right? So he's still pretty personal in that way. And then later on he goes towards God, kind of divine inspiration, and then that through yourself will make you have that unique poet's like imagination, right? Blake, again, super individualistic. Like these things come from the spiritual realm again through Blake, and then every person he believes comes to their salvation through being an artist. So as long as you can see and think like an artist and access that realm, you can output that, and you're kind of within the realm of salvation. Shelley, same pattern. He just doesn't really see God in part of that picture. He is more of a pagan sort of view of spirituality just being within nature, within the world, and kind of this invisible pattern underneath it all that we can access and then draw from and have our creative genius that way. So those are those folks, and I think now we can kind of turn a little bit more towards the Victorian era, talk about Tennyson as kind of a culmination of how the Victorians were influenced by the Romantics, and then we could talk a little bit more about what that means for religion today too, if you want.
Yeah.
Okay, so I won't spend too much time on this because I think Tennyson is more straightforward. Tennyson was the poet laureate for England after Wordsworth, actually. So Wordsworth dies in 1850, and Tennyson comes in and he becomes the poet laureate. So a lot of his poetry is, somewhat political, right? It's somewhat religious. It's kind of, in a lot of ways, supporting the status quo. He's pretty conservative, but Tennyson is also extremely authentic too. Like, he does get that authenticity from the Romantics, I think, and that authenticity, that emotion, that personal connection, that sticks throughout the Victorian era, I think, for the most part, and they do value it. When I was reading for exams, it was interesting. I came across something that said that in the Victorian era, church attendance was down 50%, which is shocking, right? I mean, you think that's something more of our modern era, and it's not that people weren't going to church. I mean, I think this was people who weren't going to the main Anglican church, and so they're kind of fracturing off into their own sects and belief systems, and some of them weren't going to church. Some of them were just kind of having their own spirituality be a more personal experience. But again, this is inherited from the Romantics, and so the Victorians are trying to figure out what to do with this, because no longer does the more okay, you go to church every Sunday, you follow these rules, you participate in society, you look like you're worshiping God, and you're Christian. No longer does that resonate with a lot of the Victorians, and so they're trying to grapple with this, because it's not like they're at our point in our society where they're secular yet, because they're really not. They still are very much believing in God. It's just, how does that resonate with them now when they're kind of getting away from ritual? And so in this case, they actually turn to poets like Wordsworth too, but Tennyson. And Tennyson, he is still pretty conservative in terms of he is in Anglican church and all that stuff, and he writes about religious and spiritual themes, but in ways that are very, very personal, and ways that are much more vulnerable and resonate, I think, with people in their individual journeys. And so we can talk about In Memoriam a little bit, but does that kind of make sense in terms of how things are sort of progressing in the Victorian era, I guess?
Sure, it definitely feels, well, it goes back to what we were kind of talking about earlier, that the Romantics calmed down a bit as they kind of got older and they mellowed out a little, but their poetry didn't necessarily come with them. So I'm curious how Tennyson picks up with that, especially because Wordsworth and Mary Shelley and the ones that lived to ripe old ages, they didn't write poetry as much as they got older, to the most part. And obviously Coleridge died relatively 50s, 60s, I believe, but
yeah,
he wasn't writing poetry as much towards the end of his life. So
yeah, he was a critic, yeah, and it's kind of sad, because I think that he saw Wordsworth as the better poet, and he sort of backed away from that too. And then he has the opium addiction that really plagued him throughout his life as well. So he ends, and he had a bad marriage and all this stuff. He ends his life. I think a friend basically becomes his patron, gives him a place to live, and he writes his criticism from there and becomes a famous critic. But poetry does seem to be kind of left behind for him. But that's a tangent. So I think with Tennyson has always been a little bit more conservative. He never had a free-spirited romantic era, but he's later than the Romantics, and so he's pretty conservative religiously, but in execution and reaching people, he's not necessarily. So one of the big things that happened in Tennyson's life is his best friend dies quite young. I think they might have both been in Oxford or something at the time, and or maybe a little bit after that, and he carries that for the rest of his life. He never really gets over it. He kind of questions his relationship with God and what that means to have someone so important from him taken so young, and his grief colors a lot of his poetry. And he wrote a very long, I think it's over 3,000 lines, poem called In Memoriam, and it's an elegy for his best friend, right? So, and it's actually really beautiful. He's drawing a lot on romantic conventions in the form of it, because basically this elegy is different like snippets of feeling and different snippets of a story. It's not like a linear plot. It's kind of just like him going through, you know, different like images and phases of grief, basically. And he circles around religion and his idea of God, and he opens up the poem by saying that, like, you know, I do have faith, you know, in God, and like that's there, but then he does not let them hold him back from grieving and having this really personal sort of experience with the poetry. And let's see, so I can kind of read some of it because I think it's really beautiful. So here, well, I guess I can read these stanzas maybe, or at least some of them. So here he is talking about his best friend, and he doesn't really name his friend throughout, so really anyone reading it can put their own grief and their own experience into it. But he says, the path by which we twain did go, which led by tracks that pleased us well, through 4 sweet years arose and fell, from flower to flower, from snow to snow, and we with singing cheered the way, and crowned with all the season lent, from April on to April went, and glad at the heart from May to May. But where the path we walked began to slant, the 5th autumnal slope, as we descended following hope, there sat the shadow feared of man. We broke our fair companionship, and spread his mantle dark and cold, and wrapped thee formless in thy fold, and dulled the murmur of thy lip, and bore thee where I could not see nor follow, though I walk in haste, and think that somewhere in the waste the shadow sits and waits for me. So here Tennyson is kind of describing how he felt about his friendship with his best friend, and basically the communion that he had, and you know how that was, you know, very deep and meaningful, and the shadow feared of man, and the descend following hope, and like this autumnal slope. You know, he's showing that like he's going down into grief, and he sees death, and he sees that shadow at the end of the light of life, kind of closing in. And now that he saw his friend die so young, he knows it's always kind of waiting there for him, right? And he doesn't meet this with the sort of expected, like, oh, when we die we're going to go to heaven. You know, he lets that grief sit there, and he lets that forebodingness sit there, right? Like that's very important for him, and he does not shy away from it. And I think what's important about that, and why it resonates back to the Victorian readership, is, like I said before, they are moving away from the tried and true ritualistic church going. They have experienced tragedies in life. Like they are becoming more, you know, aware of their own individuality thanks to the Romantics. So they need this sort of like, what kind of poetry, what kind of, you know, beauty and art will resonate with me, and not tell me how to feel, but let me feel, right? But what's interesting about Tennyson is that he does always go back to God and the more orthodox sort of view, and so he brings people through grief but then brings them back. And this seems to kind of resonate again with the Victorians a little bit more. It's more human. They're not being told what to do or think or feel. They still have that romantic expressionism, but then they're led back too. So that's kind of where Tennyson's at.
I guess that more or less brings us back up to now, for better or for, you know, for the sake of discussion. Obviously, a couple months ago you saw I did a review of Andrew Clavin's book on Romanticism, where he makes the case that Romanticism is a tool that can lead back to spirituality and religion in the modern world, because as he makes, you know, you mentioned, obviously this is all happening in the aftermath of the Enlightenment. There's a sense of dryness and tragedy to the world that's kind of creeping up on them. They haven't endured a century of world wars and Darwinism and everything we have, but they just kind of sense the problems ahead of time, and they're able to kind of live with that. So I mean, but you know, Andrew Clavin makes that case that Romanticism does offer that path of spirituality, as you've clearly explored through these examples, that there is these deep sense of the role of the artist, and how you can draw meaning and beauty from nature through the role of the artist, and how you're supposed to use this as a mechanism to delve into your inner self and draw yourself closer to truth. So I guess two-part question here, but what do you think that we can? What does this have to offer for religion now, and how does this apply to your own sense of spirituality in your work?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, those are big questions, I think, too. And
Well, yeah, maybe these are maybe they're big questions to end on, but just to answer as you see fit. So.
Yeah. Well, I think for me too, part of why I moved away from criticism and completing the PhD myself was because I felt more like a romantic than I wanted to study the romantics. And not that I don't study them, I still do. But I think so. In order to avoid the pitfall of becoming too self-centered while following the romantics, and I kind of remember some of Clavin's argument, but it's been a while since I've read him. But this might speak to it. In order to not like become myopic, right, and self-centered, and kind of self-implode with the romantic era and get to nihilism, I think what the romantics can bring us is a sense of responsibility for our own faith. They really press upon people to self-examine. They press upon people to not believe just because someone's telling them to believe something, but to observe and understand with their own mind, right? They really have handed the responsibility of your own spiritual relationship with God to you, and that's a huge change. And I think that that's what it means to become mature in the spirit with God, at least for myself. And that's why the romantics still resonate with me. They do go off on these crazy tangents that I don't agree with, and some of their cores I don't agree with, but the fact that they say, their spiritual responsibility is on the individual, that to me is why they mean so much to me, because I really believe in that. So that's kind of how it fits, I think, with how I understand my life and how I make decisions and how I understand God, is because I have a confident relationship with God too. And the romantics did kind of teach me that. That's a big part of it. And with my art too, similar things. Like my art is not necessarily like what's popular now. I kind of go back to a lot of traditional stuff and put my own spin on it. That's not really what postmodernism is interested in, but I don't really care. Again, it's that like I kind of know myself and I know what I want to say, and I know my spirituality because I've taken that responsibility. So I think that's what we can ultimately learn from the romantics. All
right, it's a good note to end on. But I guess just for the sake of profitability. Where can people find your work online? I know obviously you have an Instagram. Where can people find that, and when is your art going to be available for people to buy prints of if they go on Instagram and like it?
Yeah, well, hopefully next year, because I've just started kind of getting into the art business. Like, it's just been a few months. But you can find me at Meaghan Murray Art on Instagram, and maybe we can put the handle in like the description or something like that. I'm gonna throw the
Blake archive and the Instagram in the link dump.
That would be awesome. Yeah. You can find me there. I do art inspired by the Pre-Raphaelites, aesthetically, as well as kind of like medieval art, and I sort of do all that through a romantic lens, and kind of how it's recontextualized for today's audience too. But yeah, I'm an oil painter. I do kind of realistic stuff, but I love turning literature and like how I see stories into beautiful art. So if you're interested in that, come check it out.
You just had one on display recently, right?
Yeah, so I just finished a painting of the Lady of Shalott, and it was inspired by Tennyson's poem of the same name, Lady of Shalott. And it is on display at the Cedarburg Art Museum up in Wisconsin. So I don't know if anyone's local to there, they could go see it. It might also be on the website, or at least the show Objects of Desire is on the website too, if you want to learn more about that.
All right, I can try to, if you can find that link and send that me, I'll throw it in the link dump too. But
sure, sounds good. And the painting's on my Instagram too. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your university lecture on all this. It was a lot more comprehensive than I was expecting, and I appreciate that. So.
Yeah, it was a lot. I'm sorry. I feel like I threw so much at you.
No.
Teaching mode. I'm like,
no. I mean, I understood enough to get by. So.
You're great. You made it more clear, I think, when you summarized things than I could have. Like, I rambled too much when I lecture, so it was great.
That's the problem with academic stuff, though. Is like whenever you talk to academics and you read a book that's like, I don't understand this. The one thing I've always heard them turn and say is, this is as dumb as I can make it. It's just, I can't make it any more simple. I'm like, well, yeah, go figure there. Yeah, my 500-page textbook on music theory. Like, okay, Great. It's not going to get any easier than that. Thanks a lot. But
Never believe a scholar when they say that that's as dumb as they can make it. They're BSing you. They're trying to be smarter than they are. That's the thing, and that's a whole other topic of why academics write the way that they do. But yeah, don't worry about that.
I mean, also I will say that academics have a monopoly on writing terribly, and not having to have any responsibility, because as long as it's technically accurate, it doesn't matter.
I have a lot of criticism on that. And I think the Romantics did too, because they were reacting against the Enlightenment. They were reacting against this hyper academic sort of worldview. So I also resonate with that.
I may be a deep lover of credentialism and name and stuff, but I'm an autodidact, so I can't like it too much. I can't. I have to understand it as a filthy layperson. So what's all I can do?
You know what? Backing into the theme of the Romantics and just like God and knowledge and anything else, I mean, you understand it, through your own lens. You find what you find and be confident in what you do find and adopt that into your own worldview. I mean, that's how we can get anywhere, really, with truth. So
there you go. Thank you very much. Have a good night.
All right, you too, Tyler.
The AntiSocial Network is a Groupthink Productions and cultural review podcast. Editing, hosting, and producing are by Tyler Hummel, art by Crystal Cowley, and original music is composed by Guap Squad Gang and Melissa Lafira. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment below and tell us anyone you think would be a good guest for the show. Thank you for listening.